The grid held for 4 hours. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward, not the falling, the holding. 17 years of human work, $11 trillion of orbital weapons locked in a net around the whole planet, and it held for 4 hours against a fleet that had shattered empires older than human. Writing 4 hours was nothing in the scale of the universe. 4 hours was everything in the scale of what humans could build. The Meridian Lattice was the name they gave it, a web of 42 orbital platforms, each one connected to the others, each one capable of redirecting fire across the whole net the moment any single node took damage. The engineers who designed it had spent 7 years arguing about the math. They had spent another 4 years arguing about the funding. When the first Kiln-Vor scout ship appeared at the edge of the solar system and started broadcasting demands in a language no human had ever heard, the arguing stopped and the building started. It was the most expensive thing humanity had ever made. It lasted 4 hours. The Kiln-Vor did not blow it apart. That was the part that haunted Admiral Petrov for the rest of his life, long after everything else had changed, and there were other things worth thinking about. They did not destroy the lattice. They reached inside it. They found the handshake protocol that allowed the 42 platforms to talk to each other. Same protocol that made the whole net so powerful, and they spoke to it in its own language and told it to sleep. The platforms did not explode. They went dark one by one, kind of like lights going out in a house at the end of the night. Petrov watched it happen from the command deck of the Resolute, which was the last functional warship in Earth's orbital defense, which was now drifting in the shadow of a Kiln-Vor capital. Ship so large it blocked the sun over Eastern Europe. He watched the last platform go dark, and he sat down in his chair, and he did not say anything for a very long time. Then he opened a channel to Geneva. "It's done, Basher," he said. That was all. The bunker under Geneva had been built during a different war against a different kind of enemy. It smelled like old concrete and recycled air, and the particular kind of fear that settles into a room when the people inside it know that what they decide in the next hour will be the thing history remembers. 12 people sat around the table because Secretary General Amara Ose stood at the head of it. She was 53 years old. She had been running the Joint Military Council for 6 years, and before that she had spent 20 years in international law. And before that she had grown up in Accra watching her mother negotiate 8 agreements with people who had all the power and none of the good intentions. She had learned early that the most important thing in any room was to be the one who understood what was actually happening. She understood what was actually happening. The vote was simple: continue, resistance, or submit. 2 options, 12 votes. The vote came back 11-0. Everyone looked at Osai. She had not voted. Abstention, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, level, precise like a surgical instrument. So, record it. The secretary at the end of the table recorded it. Nobody asked her why. Nobody in that room had the energy left to ask. Osai walked to the transmission console. She stood in front of it for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to arrange her face and her breathing into something that would not embarrass the species. Then she activated the broadcast. Every ship in the Kiln-Vor fleet received the signal. Every human Settlement on Earth and the Moon. Received it, every orbital station still. Running received it. The 14 other species the Kilnvor had conquered, watching from their own worlds at the edge of the Dominion's reach, received it too, though they received it later. The signal traveling at the speed of light across distances that made the word vast feel small. When Osei read the terms of humanity's submission, her voice did not shake. This would be used against her for the rest of her life. People would say she was cold. People would say she did not feel it. People would make documentaries and write books and record podcasts asking why the woman who surrendered Earth to an alien empire sounded like she was reading a quarterly budget report. She felt everything. She kept it out of her voice because the species needed her to keep it out of her voice. That was the job. That had always been the job. She finished reading, closed the channel, walked back to her seat, sat down. The room was quiet. What happens now? Someone asked. Now we wait for their lawyers, Osa said. The Kilnvor lawyers arrived in a shuttle that landed in Geneva 6 hours later. They were tall and gray-skinned with eyes that sat slightly too far apart on their faces and voices that sounded like two people speaking at the same time. Always, even when they were being perfectly pleasant, 3 of them, they brought documents. The documents were not what anyone expected. There were no execution orders, no mass relocations, no lists of humans to be removed, imprisoned, or made into examples. The Kilnvor legal team sat across the table from what remained of the Joint Military Council, and they laid out their terms with the calm, thorough efficiency of people who had done this many times before and expected it to go smoothly. Humanity was to be reclassified from uncontacted sovereign species, the designation they had held since the Kilnvor first found evidence of human civilization, to productive labor asset sector tier 3. The existing governments would stay, the infrastructure would stay, the schools, hospitals, transport networks, communication systems, all of it would stay because it was more efficient to let the humans maintain what the humans had built than to replace it with Dominion systems. The flags would stay. The flags would stay. Osei looked at the word flags in the document and felt something move in her chest. She kept her face level and read on. Humans would pay resource tributes, a percentage of industrial output redirected to Dominion supply chains, percentage of the population available for off-world labor assignments on a rotating basis, voluntary in theory, incentivized in ways that made voluntary a complicated word. Military service in Dominion campaigns, for which humans would be compensated according to Tier 3 scales, which were modest but real. The Kilnvor legal team was polite. They offered water. They answered questions. They did not threaten anyone. This was the worst part. The absence of cruelty made it very hard to find a handhold for the rage that every person in that room was holding behind their eyes. Cruelty would have been something to push against. This was an administrative procedure. Humanity was being filed. Osei read every line of the document. She read it again. She asked for modifications on 7 points. The Kilnvor legal team considered each one and granted 4 of them, which surprised everyone, including Osei, who had expected 0. The modifications she got were small, mostly procedural, mostly about timelines except one, and The clause she asked for quietly, almost as an afterthought buried between a section on tribute payment schedules and a section on communication protocols. She framed it in language so dense and bureaucratic that even her own team's eyes glazed over when she read it aloud. The submitted species retains the right to cultural expression as defined, clears throat by its own internal tradition subject to productivity, maintenance. The lead Kilnvor lawyer read it, looked up. This is already implied by the standard Tier 3 framework. Then it costs you nothing to make it explicit, Osa. A pause. The three lawyers looked at each other with a look Osa could not read because she did not yet know their faces well enough to read them. Agreed, the lead lawyer said. They moved on. Osa did not write down what she was thinking. Oh, why she did not say it to anyone in that room. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she understood that other people did not yet understand, the part her mother had always called her long drawer. She would be dead for 30 years before anyone found out what she had actually done. The galaxy watched. 847. Cataloged species under dominion. Control. From the barnacle empires of the Vreth. Collective which communicated through patterns of mineral secretion and had been Tier 2 assets for 600 years, too. The sorrow chorus, 12-minded and ancient, and shattered into compliance a century before humanity made its first steam engine. They all received Osai's broadcast. They all processed it through whatever system they used to understand the world, and they all reached the same conclusion. This is where the human story ends. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was the conclusion every analyst in the Dominion reached, and the Dominion had 3,000 years of data, species at this stage of development, at this level of technological advancement, facing an opponent with this kind of capability. Gap. The math was not interesting. The outcome was settled. The sorrow chorus watched and felt what they felt, which was a complicated and heavy thing with no clean translation, something between grief and recognition. They had been here. They knew what this floor felt like. Under you. They did not yet know that humanity was not standing on the same floor. The formal signing happened the next day. Real pens, real paper, however, because the Kilnvor legal tradition required physical documents for species submissions. The lead lawyer explained this without any apparent sense of the weight of it. Osai signed. The council signed. The document was taken away in a case made of something that was not metal but behaved like it. The lawyers shook hands because they had learned the human greeting and understood its function, even if they did not fully feel it. They left. The bunker was very quiet. People stood up slowly. Someone turned on a light that had been off. Someone else picked up a coffee cup that had been cold for 4 hours and looked at it and put it back down. Osai stayed in her seat until the room was empty. Then she gathered her things. Her coat, the notes she had taken on a yellow legal pad, not 12 pages of dense handwriting that would later be archived and analyzed by historians who would spend decades arguing about what she had known, and clears throat when she had known it. She tucked the pad under her arm. She walked out of the bunker, up 3 flights of stairs, out into the Geneva afternoon, which was cold and gray and smelled like rain that had already fallen. A security detail was waiting. They fell in around her without Speaking. She went home. She sat down on the floor of her living room, which was something she had not done since she was a child. The security detail was outside the door. The lights were off. Through the window she could see the lights of the city, which were all on, all normal. Albeit because Geneva was still Geneva. And the infrastructure was still the infrastructure, and the Kelver had not broken anything they could see. She cried for 1 hour. She had been keeping it back for 4 days since the moment Petrov's first distress signal had come through, and she had understood what the numbers meant. 1 hour was all she allowed herself. It was not nothing. It was also not enough, but nothing would have been enough, and she was not in the business of enough. She was in the business of next. After 1 hour she got up, washed her face, made tea, sat down at her desk. She had work to do. Not the work of surrender, not the work of managing the transition to Dominion administration. Though that would take years, and she would do most of it, and it would be the hardest thing she ever did. The other work, the long work, or the work that did not have a name yet. She opened a new document. At the top she typed a single line, which she then deleted because it was not the kind of thing you left in writing, but she had thought it, and thinking it was enough. She typed, "They think this is an ending." Then she deleted it, started the real document, the one about cultural preservation committees and community expression grants, and a dozen other things that sounded, in the language of Dominion compliance frameworks, like nothing at all. Outside, the Geneva lights stayed on. The planet kept turning. Humanity had just been filed under Tier 3. It had no idea what it was about to do. In the weeks that followed, the Kelver began the administrative transition with the calm efficiency of an organization that had done this many times. Regional oversight offices were established, tribute calculation teams arrived, labor assignment coordinators set up processing centers in 7 major cities. They were professional, they were prompt, they answered questions in 47 languages using translation technology that was 300 years more advanced than anything humans had built. They did not pay much attention to the cultural expression committees that began forming in small offices all over the planet. The committees were listed in the documentation as standard Tier 3 compliance measures. The Kelver coordinators looked at the forms, checked the box, and moved on to more important things. The forms were in the documentation because OSA had put them there. The boxes were checked because the lawyers had signed a clause that made them checkable. Nobody looked twice. This was exactly what OSA had been counting on. She spent the next 2 years working 18 hours a day building the infrastructure of what would later be called the quiet work, the vast, patient, invisible project of keeping humanity's soul alive inside a bureaucratic cage built by people who did not understand what a soul was or why it mattered. She was not building weapons. She was building something slower and more dangerous. She was building the conditions under which humans would keep being human. The Kelver watched none of this because they were not looking for it. They were looking for resistance. Cells, weapons caches, encrypted military communications, all the things that conquered species typically hid in the early years of occupation, and they found some of those things and dealt with them efficiently. They did not look at the painting classes. They did not look at the music schools. They storytelling circles, the digital archives of human literature and history that were being quietly duplicated and stored in locations that were technically public record and therefore outside the scope of subversive content. Monitoring. They were not looking for those things. They would not understand for a very long time what those things actually were. By then it would be far clear's throat. Too late, OSI filed her last major policy document 3 years into the occupation, retired from public service, citing age and exhaustion, and spent the rest of her life as a private citizen in Accra who grew tomatoes and answered approximately 1 in every 100 requests for interviews. She left behind a lot of paper, most of it looked boring, none of it was. When she died 22 years into the occupation, the Kelver Regional Coordinator for West Africa filed a routine notification. 1 Tier 3 asset, non-essential. Administrative deceased, logged and processed. He did not know what he was logging. No one told him. That was the point. Vethsar arrived on Earth in the 11th year of the occupation on a Tuesday in the rain. He noticed the rain first. His home world had rain or something like it, a heavier thing, more chemical, that left marks on stone. Earth's rain was thin and cold and smelled like something clean. He stood in it for a moment outside the transport dock in Geneva before his aide reminded him that rain damaged administrative documents, and he went inside. His file was immaculate. Why 22 years of service, 6 previous occupied worlds, all 6 still in full compliance, productivity metrics above Dominion projections in 4 of them. He had a system. He had always had a system. You came in, you established the resource flow, you built working relationships with the most rational members of the local administrative class. You suppressed the irrational ones firmly and early, and then the whole thing ran itself. He expected Earth to take about 3 years to fully stabilize. This was his first era. The regional headquarters had been built inside what used to be an international trade center, which the Kelver had converted with minimal structural changes because it was already the right shape, large, efficient, connected. Vethsar walked through it on his first day and noted the things his predecessor had done well and the things he would change. He was making notes on his third walkthrough when he saw the painting on his door, not on the door of the building, on the specific door of his specific office, which was inside the building, which was inside a secured perimeter, which humans were not supposed to enter without appointment. It was small, a piece of paper, roughly 20 cm by 30, something with wings made in colors that were not quite accurate to any bird he had seen in the biological survey files, orange and red, and a deep burning yellow under the wings, shapes that might have been ash or might have been a city. He could not tell. No message, no signature. He looked at his aide. Who left this? His aide checked the security logs. A child 8 years old, daughter of a logistics coordinator who had a scheduled maintenance appointment that morning and had apparently brought her daughter along. The child had walked to his door and left the painting and walked back. No reason logged, no reason given. Vethsar stood looking at the painting for longer than made sense. Then he filed it in the anomalous incidents folder labeled subcategory unknown and went back to his reports. He did not throw it away. This was his second error. The occupation in year 11 was settled. The way that all Dominion occupations look settled from the outside. Tribute payments were on schedule. The labor assignment quotas were being met. Mostly, the resistance cells that had been active in years 2 through 7 had been dealt with. Some captured, some gone quiet, some absorbed into the legitimate administrative structure because their members had figured out that working inside the system kept more of their people alive than fighting outside it. The streets were calm, the transit systems ran. From a Dominion reporting perspective, Earth was boring. Vethsar began to suspect, within about 4 months, that Earth was the least boring thing he had ever administered. It started with small things, the kind of things that did not fit into any category in the standard reporting framework, so they kept getting listed under anomalous non-priority clears throat, which was the administrative equivalent of a drawer where you put things you did not understand but did not have time to think about. A garrison unit in what had been Sao Paulo reported that several of its soldiers had stopped eating alone. During rest cycles, they were instead eating with their assigned local logistics team. This was not a violation of any regulation. It was irregular. It had not happened on any of the other 6 worlds Vethsar had administered. He flagged it and watched it. The garrison unit in the Pacific coastal sector reported that a local music group had asked permission to perform at the facility during the celebration that humans apparently held near the end of their calendar year. The garrison commander had granted permission because the regulations permitted it, and it had seemed, in his words, administratively harmless. The music was performed. The garrison commander filed a follow-up note the next week, observing that the soldiers who attended the performance were testing 7% more productively on concentration metrics than those who had not. He noted this with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement. Vethsar read the report twice, thought about it, could not find the right category for it. He moved on, but he kept reading the reports, the anomalous non-priority reports that most administrators deleted. After scanning, he read all of them. He created a secondary file. He put things in it. The file grew. In year 14, the painting moved. Specifically, Vethsar moved it. He had looked at it on his office door every day for 3 years. Then, and at some point he could not have said precisely when, it had stopped being an anomalous incident and started being something else, something he could not name in his own language, which was unusual because his language had 412 words for categories of administrative data, and he had never encountered a thing that did not fit one of them. He brought the painting inside his office. He set it on the shelf behind his desk where he could see it when he worked. His aide asked about it once. "It's for reference," Vethsar said. His aide did not ask again. What he did not say, and what he was only beginning to understand about himself, was that the painting did something to the quality of his thinking. Not the content, not the efficiency, just the quality. And working with it in his line of sight felt different from working without it, in a way he did not have a word for, and therefore kept not writing down. In year 17, the music clears throat started appearing in the administrative network. No one knew exactly how it had gotten in. The Calver communication and logistics infrastructure was, like all Dominion systems designed to be functionally separate from local cultural content. The systems that moved tribute, calculations, and labor assignments were not connected to the systems that carried entertainment content, except that the humans who ran and maintained those systems, the administrators and data workers who spent their days inside the logistics network, had gradually, quietly, over years of small decisions that each individually crossed no regulation, built tiny bridges, audio files are marked as system environment, calibration data, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute, embedded in the background noise of data, packages moving through the network, nothing that would trigger a content scan, just sound, just human music traveling along the inside of a Dominion logistics system, reaching ears that had never heard it before. The first time Vethsar heard it, he was working at 300 because a tribute shipment had been delayed, and he was trying to find the error in the calculation chain. He had the network audio running as background because silence at that hour did strange things to his attention. Something played in the background. He stopped. He could not have said what made it different from the standard calibration tones, something in the intervals, somewhere, something in the way the sound came back to itself after moving away, like it was following a logic he had not been told about, something that moved in his chest in the way that the painting moved his thinking, but stronger. He sat with it for 4 minutes, then he opened a sound file search and spent 2 hours tracing the embedded audio back through 6 layers of the network. He found 411 similar files. He filed a report. Then he went back to the tribute calculation, found the error, fixed it, submitted the correction, and sat for another moment with the sound in his ears. He did not flag the music files for removal. This was his 3rd error and the most significant. The letter from the Sorrel Chorus arrived in year 19 through a diplomatic channel, so old and informal that Vethsar almost missed it, while the Sorrel Chorus had been Dominion assets for 140 years, 12-minded, ancient, and quiet in the way that very old grief was quiet. They did not communicate often with other asset species. They did not communicate at all with Dominion administration if they could avoid it. The letter was addressed somehow to no one at the administrative level. It was addressed to a person, a specific human named Dr. Chen Wei, who ran the Cultural Preservation Archive at what had been Beijing University, and who was, in the administrative record, listed as a Tier 3 education coordinator, non-essential, no security flag. The letter said, "We were where you are. We did not do what you are doing. We do not know the name for what you are doing. We are watching. We think it is working." Dr. Chen Wei read the letter and sat with it for a long time. Then he scanned it and embedded it in a file-marked system, calibration audio subset 7, and sent it into the network. Within 3 months, the letter had been read by approximately 9 million humans. Vethsar found out about this in year 21 when he was reviewing a data routing irregularity that turned out to be the scan of the letter writing along the same bridges the music files used. He read the letter, he thought about it. He went back to his reports. But later that night, he stood in front of the painting for a while, the one with wings, the one from the girl who was now a young woman with her own labor Assignment somewhere in the Nordic. Processing sector. He looked at the colors, the burning. Orange and the deep yellow, the ashore. City underneath, he had looked at it. For 10 years now, he was starting to understand what it was a picture of. The report he filed in year 22 was 700 pages long. This clear's throat was not normal. Standard administrative reports from Dominion compliance directors averaged between 20 and 40 pages. Even the most complex occupied worlds had not generated reports over 300 pages. 700 pages was, in the history of Dominion administrative reporting, unprecedented. High Command received it and took 12 days to send back a response, which was also unprecedented. Normally, they responded within 48 hours. The executive summary of Vethsar's report was 3 sentences. The human asset is compliant by all measurable metrics. It is not, however, contained. I am requesting definitional clarification on the boundary between productive labor asset and cultural hazard. The 700 pages behind that summary were a meticulous, careful, thoroughly documented account of every anomalous incident Vethsar had collected over 11 years. The garrison soldiers eating with local teams, the music and the logistics network, the letter from the sorrel chorus, the 44 other data workers he had identified who were building bridges between Dominion systems and human cultural content, the measurement he had made quietly and informally of the difference in operational performance between units with significant human social contact and units without it. The difference was 9% in favor of the units with contact. 9% was not a large number. 9%, I know, compounded over years across 1,000 installations, was a very large number. He had included the math. He had also included in an appendix that he thought long about before adding a personal observation. It was not the kind of thing that went in administrative reports. He had written it and deleted it and written it again and included it because he could not find the right place to put it anywhere else, and it seemed important. I have administered 6 occupied worlds. On none of them did I feel at any point that I was being changed by the act of administration. I feel that now. I am uncertain whether this is relevant to the report's conclusions, but I am uncertain also whether I can trust the report's conclusions without disclosing it. High Command's response after 12 days was one word: maintain. Vethsar read the word for a long time. Then he went back to maintaining. But he kept the secondary file. He kept collecting the reports that didn't fit the categories. He kept the painting on the shelf behind his desk. He kept not flagging the music files for removal, technically, because removing them would require a formal content suppression order, and filling out a content suppression order required a justification, and he technically did not have a clean regulatory justification, which was a thing he told his aide once. When his aide mentioned it, his aide looked at him for a moment with an expression Vethsar had never seen on anyone's face before, and did not have a word for. His aide said nothing and went back to work. In year 30, a woman named Adaxa, and the granddaughter of the logistics coordinator whose daughter had left the painting, sent Vethsar a new painting. He had not known about the first painting's maker. He had looked eventually through the security logs. But the girl from year 11 had grown up and moved, and he had not looked hard enough to find her, but granddaughters knew the stories grandmothers told, and the story of the painting on the administrator's door had apparently been told many times. The new painting was bigger, more confident. It had the same wings, the same burning colors, but now the figure at the center was clearer. A bird, or something like a bird, rising out of what was clearly a fire. Beak open, eyes forward. Underneath the wings, clearly visible. Now not ash or city, but both. City becoming ash, becoming sky. Vethsar had it framed. He moved it to the wall. He had not understood 11 years ago what the first painting was. He understood now. He was not sure yet what he was going to do with that understanding, but he kept it on the wall where he could see it, and every morning when he came in to start the day's reports, he looked at the burning bird rising out of the burning city, and he thought about a word that he did not have in his own language. He had found it in the human archives, in the etymology files, a word that humans had been using for 3,000 years. He had been trying to understand it for 19. He was getting closer. There is no Kelver word for hope. There wasn't. Past tense is the important part of that sentence. The xenolinguists who worked for the Dominion Language Institute were, by any standard in the known galaxy, were the best at their work. 3,000 years of practice, 1,700 languages cataloged, translated, and cross-referenced. The Language Institute had cracked the communication system of the FREF collective, which communicated entirely through mineral secretion patterns. They had translated the sorrow chorus, 12 minds speaking as one in frequencies that sat between sound and mathematics. They had done things with language that no other species in the Dominion had managed. They could not translate hope. They tried 17 times over the course of 40 years, 17 different working groups, 17 different approaches. The results were all technically accurate and all completely wrong. And in the way that a photograph of a fire is technically accurate and completely does not convey what fire does to you when you are standing next to it. Translation 1 called it positive probability projection, which was accurate as far as it went. Humans did project positive outcomes, but the definition missed the thing. Where humans projected positive outcomes, even when the math said not to, even when the math said the outcome was nearly impossible. They did it anyway, not because they were bad at math, because they had decided somewhere deep in the structure of how they thought that the math was not the whole story. Translation 8 called it anticipatory state management, which caught more of it but still missed the center. It made hope sound like a technique, like something you did to your brain to make it more efficient. Humans sometimes did that, but that was not what hope was. Hope was not management. Hope was something closer to stubbornness that had learned to point forward instead of backward. Translation 14 came closest. A junior researcher wrote in her notes, "The problem is that we keep trying to describe hope as a cognitive state, and it may in fact be a moral position. Humans hope not because they believe a good outcome is likely, but because they have decided it is right to act as though it might be. This is very strange. I am not sure we have a cognitive category for deciding that an improbable thing is worth treating as real." Her supervisor crossed out that note and replaced it with a cleaner definition. The clean definition was wrong. The crossed-out note was right. Nobody found it for another 60 years. Hernani. The contagion spread the way the best. Infection spread not through air, not through contact with something sharp, through time spent in the same room, sharing food, sharing work, sharing the specific human habit of treating other beings like they were interesting. The Dominion had a regulation for this. Regulation 7 of the occupied species. Management framework. Military and administrative personnel stationed on occupied worlds were to rotate out every 5 years. The regulation had been written 400 years ago after an incident on the fourth occupied world, where a garrison unit that had been stationed too long had begun showing signs of what the report called operational drift, a gradual shift in behavior and priority that made the unit less useful as an instrument of Dominion control, and more useful, oddly, when it was an instrument of whatever the local species wanted. The regulation existed because the Dominion had learned this lesson. Once, the regulation did not work on Earth. Not because humans broke it. The rotations happened on schedule. Units came in, served 5 years, rotated out. The math was clean. The logistics were clean. The records were clean. The problem was that 5 years was enough. 5 years was enough to learn 40 words of a local language because the work team you were assigned to only spoke that language, and it was easier than the translation device. 5 years was enough to attend 1 or 2 or 7 local gatherings because the regulations permitted cultural observation for professional development purposes, and it turned out human cultural gatherings were interesting in a way that was hard to explain in a report. 5 years was enough to have a conversation with a human child who asked you questions that nobody had asked you before. Simple questions like what your home world smelled like and whether you missed it. 5 years was enough. The soldiers who rotated out carried something home that had no item number in any Dominion manifest. They went back to their home stations, their home planets, their families. They used human words sometimes when their own language was imprecise. They described things they had seen and eaten and heard. They recommended human music to their friends in the same way that someone recommends a meal that they cannot quite explain why they want you to try. The friends tried it. The friends told other friends. Secondary and tertiary spread. The xenolinguists had a model for this, a borrowed from biological infection mapping. They would use it later, much later, when they were trying to explain to high command what had happened. The model was perfectly accurate. The model did not make anyone feel better. Reva Kane was 23 years old, and she was angry in the way that people are angry when they were born into something they did not choose and have decided very clearly and consciously not to pretend that it's fine. She had been born in year 8 of the occupation. Her mother had been a labor coordinator in Lagos. Her father had been one of the resistance cell members who went quiet in year 6 and came back into the administrative structure because, as he told Reva when she was old enough to ask, you can be dead and useless or alive and annoying. And I chose annoying. She had inherited this philosophy entirely. She was working as a liaison officer, which meant she sat between the Kelver administrative apparatus and the human managers who actually ran the day-to-day Logistics, translating not just language but intention, she was good at it because she had grown up doing it, walking between her father's bitterness and her mother's pragmatism, finding the exact words that could live in both rooms at once. She did not like the work. She was very good at the work. She had been watching something for 3 years and she did not know what to call it. She started keeping her own file, a different file from the official reports, her own document on a personal device, which she backed up in 3 locations, because she had grown up in a house where you always had copies of the things that mattered. The file had no title at the top because she had not yet found the right one. She wrote in it every few weeks, small observation, things she noticed. The garrison commander for the Eastern European sector attended a human funeral last month. He was there because of a protocol meeting that happened to fall on the same day as the funeral, and the meeting was in the same building. He was only there for 20 minutes. He filed for stress evaluation 2 weeks later. The stress evaluator's report noted, and I am quoting directly here, subject is exhibiting signs of an unclassified emotional processing event, but it possibly related to occupational exposure. That is a Kelver stress evaluator describing what happens when a Kelver soldier watches humans bury someone they love. I don't know what to do with that. I think I know what to do with that. She wrote in the file for 3 years. Then she had 48 pages, and she read them from the beginning and understood what she had been watching. She did the only thing she could think to do. She wrote a proper report and sent it to every channel she had access to, which was not many, but was more than 0. The subject line was, "They are changing." The report was 4 pages short. She had wanted to make it shorter, but she needed the evidence, and the evidence took 4 pages. She laid out everything she had: the funeral, the stress evaluations, the music, the language drift in official Kelver, administrative correspondence, which had started using human syntactic structures in ways that were subtle but measurable. The garrison soldiers who had started eating with local teams, the slow accumulation of 100 small things that individually meant nothing and together meant something enormous. She ended the report with, "I am not a scientist. I am a person who grew up watching 2 very different kinds of people try to understand each other, and I know what this looks like. This looks like understanding. This looks like it is happening to them without their permission. Someone smarter than me should be paying attention to this. Someone who can figure out what it means and what comes next." She sent it. She did not expect much, or she went back to her desk and filed 3 routine liaison reports and ate a meal that was whatever food was available, which was what it usually was, and went to bed at a normal hour. The next morning she had a notification. Regional Compliance Director Vethsar had read her report and was requesting a meeting. She stared at the notification. For a long time, she reached for anger, like she reached for water, because anger was steady and familiar and kept her upright in the situations where she did not know what the ground was doing. Then she stood up and went to the meeting. Vethsar's office was not what she expected. She had never been inside it before. From the outside, all the Kelver administrative buildings looked the same: functional, clean, built for efficiency, which meant no decoration, no wasted space, and no color that was Not structural, his office had. Paintings, not one, not a few, an entire wall. She stopped in the doorway and looked at them. They were all variations on the same image, different sizes, different hands, different ages of maker, some childish, some technically skilled, all made of similar colors. Orange, red, yellow. A bird with wings extended, rising out of fire or ash or rubble. Some of them had cities underneath, some had just light. 90-something paintings. Maybe more. She stopped counting. Sit down, Vethsar said. She sat down. She kept looking at the wall. You've read my report, she said, many times, and he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall too. Here and there was something in the way he looked at it that Reva recognized from her own face. In mirrors, the look of someone who has spent a long time with a thing that they do not have the right words for. Tell me what the bird means, he said. She looked at him. You don't know what a phoenix is. I know what the survey files say about it. I would like to know what it means to you. This was not the question she had expected. She had expected interrogation, management, some form of administrative response to her report that involved telling her to tone it down and go back to her desk. She had prepared arguments. She had prepared specific, well-sourced counter-arguments. She had not prepared for being asked what a mythological bird meant to her. It's a bird that burns, she said. When it dies, it catches fire, and then it comes back out of the same fire. It cannot be killed. It can be killed. It dies every time. That's the point. He looked at the paintings. It comes back from death, he said. It comes back from its own death specifically. It has to die first. The dying is the mechanism. Silence. She watched him think. Thinking showed on his face in a way she had not expected. A Kelver administrator showing his thinking on his face. That was another thing for her file. She stored it. We were always going to lose, weren't we? He said. It was such a quiet thing. Said so simply, like he had been carrying the question for a while, and finally decided to put it down. She reached for the anger, the familiar steady thing. It was there. It kept her even. We've been kneeling for 100 years, she said. Ari, you tell me. He did not tell her. He looked at the wall for a long time. Then he looked back at her, and his face had changed into something she could not fully read, but felt in the way you feel the drop in air pressure before weather changes. The commission will come, he said. High command will send people. They will assess what your report describes, and they will make recommendations. I know the recommendations will not be good. She looked at him steadily. I know that too. He nodded like something had been confirmed that he already suspected. He looked at the wall one more time, and then he opened his desk console and went back to his reports. She was being dismissed. She stood up when the door stopped. The first one, she said, on the far left, who made it, a child. Her grandmother was a logistics coordinator. She brought her to a maintenance appointment. How long have you had it? 30 years. Rivakane looked at the first painting. Small, slightly crooked, the fire more orange than anything else, the bird barely recognizable as a bird, the way a child draws something it has been told about but not yet seen. She drew that when she was 8, Riva said. Yes. She's my mother. The air in the room went very still. Vethsar looked at her, then at the Painting then back at her, she said. Nothing else. She walked out. The evaluation commission arrived 4 months later, 12 of the Dominion's finest analytical minds with full access to all administrative records, all garrison reports, all cultural content, archives. They were given 1 year. Well, they filed their report in 8 months. The report was classified so deeply that fewer than 40 beings in the galaxy ever read it. Its conclusions were careful, precise, and completely devastating. The cultural drift was not localized to Earth. It had spread through the secondary and tertiary networks, the bridges the human data workers had built, the music and the logistics system, the letters from the sorrow chorus, 20 years of small contact, compounding and spreading. 11% of Dominion operational staff in the affected quadrant showed measurable psychological deviation. Deviation toward what? The Commission was careful about this word. For them, they said deviation from standard compliance enforcement orientation, which meant that 11% of Dominion staff in the region were increasingly unlikely to do the things that Dominion staff were supposed to do without question, not because they had been converted to any human belief system, because they had spent time around humans and the experience had done something to the part of them that made unquestioning things easier. The report noted that this percentage doubled approximately every 9 years. The report noted that there was no identified mechanism for reversal. The report concluded with a recommendation. The recommendation was in an appendix. The appendix had one word. Vethsar read it on a Tuesday morning. He sat with that one word for 6 hours. Then he looked at the paintings on his wall, all 91 of them, and the burning birds with their wings open and the fire underneath, and the cities becoming ash, becoming sky. He thought about a woman named Adais, Rivaz's mother, who had painted the first one when she was 8 years old in the colors of something that burned and could not stay burned. He thought about a word in a human language that 17 translation attempts had failed to capture. He closed the report. He opened a new document. He began to write. Praetor Vethsar gave the extermination order at 400 Standard Time on a morning in the 47th year of the occupation. She was not angry. This is the most important thing about her. She was not cruel, and she was not afraid, and she was not driven by anything that resembled hatred. She was a woman who had spent 40 years making decisions with an empire's weight behind them, and she had learned to keep her thinking clean. You could not afford to let emotion into the room when you were making the kinds of decisions she made. Emotion was imprecision. Imprecision cost lives at scale. She had made her peace with this a long time ago. The evaluation commission's report sat on her desk. She had read it 6 times. She had run the projections herself, checking the commission's math, because this was the kind of decision you check the math on. Their math was correct. 11% deviation. Now 22% in 9 years, 44% in 18. The curve did not stop at 44%. The curve did not stop at any number that looked manageable. She thought about a gangrenous limb. You felt things about the limb. You had carried it for years. It had done things. It had been useful. You still took it off because the alternative was dying. The Kelver Dominion was 3,000 years old. She intended it to be the same handwriting she used for budget Approvals, signed it, logged it. At 4:12 it reached Vethsar. He read it once, read it again. He was still at his desk. He had been at his desk for most of the night, which was a thing he had taken to doing in the week since the commission's report landed. Sleeping was not easy when you were sitting with a thing you did not know what to do with, and he had decided the honest response to not knowing what to do with it was to stay awake and keep thinking. One of the order used words that were very clean and very clear and left no room for misunderstanding. Protocol silence, authorization code. Sorrel Preter primary, initiate within 48 hours. Protocol silence was the oldest emergency measure in the Dominion's operational playbook. It was not used often. It had been used 11 times in 3,000 years. It meant total termination of the asset in question by whatever method the local garrison commander determined was most efficient. With orbital bombardment assets repositioned to ensure completion, he looked at the painting wall. 91 paintings, 47 years of them. The oldest one, made by a girl who was now a grandmother, was in the top left corner where the morning light hit it. First, he sat for a long time, then he opened a transmission channel. Every garrison commander under his authority received a message at 4:38. Stand down. Authorization code, Vethsar. Primary, do not acknowledge this order. To command, do not act on protocol. Silence, wait further instruction. He sent it, then he sat back down and looked at the painting wall and waited to see what he had just done to himself. Revacane, he got the word at 05:23. She was in a logistics bay in Lagos, the kind of place she had spent most of her adult life in. Large, functional, smelling of composite materials and the particular exhaustion of people who had been working through the night because the shipment schedules did not care what hour it was. She was sitting on a crate going through discrepancy reports on a tablet, which was the kind of work that kept your hands busy while your brain went elsewhere. The message came through a channel she was not supposed to have access to. She had access to it because she had spent 20 years building the kind of relationships that gave you access to channels you were not supposed to have, which was the specific kind of trust that grew in the specific kind of work she did. The message was short, 3 sentences. She read it, set the tablet down on the crate very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, even when you are not sure it is fragile. Picked it up again. Read it again. The logistics bay was loud around her. Forklifts, voices, the routine industrial noise of an occupation that had been going on longer than she had been alive. She thought about her mother, who had walked into a Kelver administrator's office at age 8 with a painting she had made because she had heard there was a Kelver person there, and she had wanted to give him something she thought was important. She thought about 30 years of paintings on a wall. She thought about the word that 17 translations had failed to capture. Her hands were not shaking. She punched the crate next to her with her right hand hard. The pain landed in her knuckles and traveled up her wrist, and she breathed through it, and the breathing steadied her, which was the point. 3 bruised knuckles, fair trade for the next part. She stood up. She had about 6 hours before the situation became something she could not manage from a logistics bay in Lagos. She needed to make those 6 hours count in ways she had been quietly impatiently preparing for since she had read Vesar's face in his office 20 years ago and understood something that she had never said out loud. She started making calls. Vesar was not the only one. This was the thing that Peter voiced Soren discovered at 0558. When the compliance report from protocol Silence came back with numbers that did not match any model she had ever run. 417 Calver installations with significant human contact exposure. Of those, 128 had not complied with protocol silence, could not, had not chosen to, 128. She had expected 0. In 3,000 years of Dominion operations, the number of compliance refusals on a direct Pretor command was 0. That was not a boast. That was simply the architecture of how the Dominion worked. Direct Pretor commands were not refused. There was not a protocol for what happened if they were, because the protocol had never been needed. She requested a secondary compliance push, a firmer signal, the kind that carried specific personal consequences for the commanders involved. The report came back, 134. It had gone up. She sat with that number in her hands like an object she had picked up and was now unsure how to put down. She pulled up the list of non-compliant installations and cross-referenced them against human contact metrics. The pattern was exactly what the Commission had predicted: high contact, high deviation, units that had spent time in proximity to humans who had learned languages, attended gatherings, unfiled the stress, evaluations after funerals, eaten meals in the wrong company. She pulled up the Commission's junior researcher's note, the one that had been crossed out. The supervisor who crossed it out was dead, retired 15 years ago. The researcher who wrote it was now a senior analyst somewhere in the language institute. The problem is that we keep trying to describe hope as a cognitive state, and it may in fact be a moral position. Humans hope not because they believe a good outcome is likely, but because they have decided it is right to act as though it might be. Soren read it 3 times. She thought about the word decided, the specific weight of it, not felt, not calculated. Decided. A voluntary act, a choice made on insufficient evidence. She thought about 128 commanders who had looked at a direct Pretor order and decided. She opened the Xenolinguist archive, all 17 failed translations. She read each one from beginning to end, which took most of an hour. She had read them before, years ago when the Commission first flagged the Hope translation problem. She had read them as a curiosity then, a linguistic puzzle. She was reading them differently now. Translation 14, the junior researchers version, the one that said hope might be a moral position, the crossed out version, they do not hope because they believe it will work, they hope because they believe it is right to. She closed the file. Outside the window of the command station, stars were doing what stars always did, to which was exist on a scale that made everything else feel like a rounding error. She had never found this comforting. She had always found it clarifying. Scale was clarifying when everything was small enough. The choices were clean. Nothing felt particularly clean right now. At 0611, Soren transmitted a message to Vesar. It was not an arrest order. It was not a disciplinary notice. It was not the thing that everyone at command who had been watching the Compliance metrics expected her to send. It said report to command, full. Briefing, bring whoever taught you to. Look at paintings. Vessar read it, he read it again, he looked at the painting wall. Bring whoever taught you to look at. Paintings, he picked up his communication device and found Reva. Kane's channel, the one she was not supposed to have, so she answered. Immediately. Are you somewhere safe? He asked. Beat. Relative to what? Fair question, I've been summoned to. Command, I've been told to bring you. A longer pause, he could hear the logistics bay in the background. Industrial noise, work continuing around. Her life going on in the way that life went on. Is this a trap? She said. I don't think so. That's not exactly reassuring. No, it is not. Why would she want me? He looked at the painting, the first one slightly crooked, made by a child, with more feeling than skill, which was a specific kind of making that turned out to matter more than making. That was skilled but empty. Because I've been talking to the Preacher voice for 20 years through those paintings and she's only just realized it, he said, itch and she wants to talk to the source, a very long pause. My mother painted the first one, Reva said. She said it the same way she'd said it to him 20 years ago, walking out of his office, flat, factual, leaving the weight of it for him to carry. I know, he said. Adaz Kane, he painted a picture for a Kelver administrator when she was 8 years old, and it ended up being the reason the Preacher voice of the Dominion asked for a meeting. Yes, another pause. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it he had not heard from her before. Underneath the flatness, he had been learning to read human voices for 30 years, and he still could not always name what he heard, but he felt it. I'll get a transport, she said, at 700. Across the planet, in 134 installations. Mara Kelver soldiers were still standing down. Some of them were doing it because they trusted their commanders and their commanders had told them to. Some of them were doing it because they had served 5 years on Earth and gone home carrying something they could not name. And when the order came down, they had felt for the first time in their lives the specific sensation of deciding that a thing was wrong even though thing was authorized. Some of them were doing it because they had read a letter from the Sorrow Chorus that had traveled through a logistics network on the back of embedded music files, and they had felt for the first time in their lives that the oldest and most conquered species in the Dominion was asking them to be better than the machine they were part of. Some of them could not have told you why, they just knew. Reva Kane, he would have recognized this, she would have known what it was called. She had grown up with the word. She had watched her father choose it over and over in the face of numbers that said not to. She had felt it in her own chest like something structural, like a second skeleton made of something that did not bend. The Kelver did not have a word for it. They were learning. At 06:58 in a logistics bay in Lagos. Before she got in the transport, Reva Kane, he stood for a moment and looked at a wall that had no paintings on it, just crates and shelving and the functional ugliness of a place that had never been designed to be looked at. She looked at it anyway. She thought about her mother, she'd who had been 8 years old when she walked into an alien administrator's building with a piece of paper and some paint and decided to give him something worth keeping, the greatest act of resistance in human history committed by a child. With a paintbrush, she got in the transport. There was no war every model Dominion Command had ever built said there would be a war. Every species in the Dominion watched the compliance fracture and heard about the extermination order that had not been carried out and waited for the obvious next thing, which was conflict, because that was always the obvious next thing. You do not refuse a praetor order without starting a war. The architecture of the Dominion was built on the certainty that you did not refuse a praetor order. The certainty turned out to be 3,000 years old and wrong. Odi Vethsar and Riva Kane arrived at command station. Reached primary on the 4th day. The journey took that long because command station reached primary was not on Earth. It was in orbit around the gas giant at the edge of the system, which the Calver had chosen as their regional headquarters because it was defensible and efficient and had the kind of cold, clear view of the whole system that administrators liked. Riva Kane looked at the planet through the transport window the whole journey. She had never been off Earth before. She was 46 years old and she had spent her entire life in the interior of the occupation, and she had never seen her own world from the outside. She did not say anything about it, but she looked dumb. And GT clears throat. And GT, the briefing room at command station. Reach primary was designed to hold 12 people and contain important discussions efficiently. Praetor voice Soren had cleared it of everyone except herself, her personal aide Vethsar and Riva Kane. Riva walked in and looked at the room, and then at Soren and stayed standing near the door because she had been carrying herself near exits for so long. It had become a physical habit, like always knowing where your keys were. Soren looked at her and then at Vethsar. Sit, Soren said. They sat. Riva picked a chair with the door in her peripheral vision. Soren did not go through the administrative formalities. She had done the formalities in 30 years of briefings, and they were useful for setting a certain kind of tone. And this was not that kind of meeting. 'Cause she put her hands on the table and looked at the two people across from it. The order stands on paper, she said. Protocol silence has not been revoked. You are technically in breach of direct command, both of you. The penalties for that are specific and severe. Riva did not move. Vethsar did not move. I need to understand, Soren said, what I am actually looking at before I decide what to do with the order. Before I decide what to do with you, I need to understand what I'm looking at. A pause. I have 17 failed translations of a word, she said. I have a report from my best commission that tells me 11% of my operational staff have been changed by proximity to your species, and that the number grows every 9 years. I have 134 commanders who looked at my order and did not execute it. She stopped. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of things that had not been said yet. I have read every file. I have run every model. I do not understand what I'm looking at. She looked at Riva. You wrote the report that named it. She said. I wrote a report, Riva said. I called it They Are Changing. Yes. What is the it in that sentence? Riva looked at her. The look was level and a little tired, and carried in it the weight of 20 years of liaison work, of standing between two very different kinds of thinking and finding the words that could live in both rooms. You're asking me what's wrong with your people, Riva said. How do I'm asking? What your species did to them, we didn't do anything to them. 11%. We were around them, Riva said. We worked with them and ate near them, and they came to our funerals and they heard our music and we talked to them. That's all. We were just around them being human. She paused. You can't turn that off. There's no version of a dominion occupation where you put people in rooms together for years and the people stay the same. That's not what people do. Soren was quiet. The word, Vethsar said he had not spoken since they sat down. His voice was careful and deliberate. The one with 17 wrong translations. If I can try. Soren looked at him. It's not a feeling, he said. I thought it was a feeling for a long time, an emotional state, something they experience passively, one but I watched them for 40 years, and it is not a feeling, it is a decision. A choice they make on no evidence. He thought about the paintings on his wall, the burning birds, the cities becoming ash, becoming sky. They decide that the future is worth acting for even when the present says it isn't. They have decided this so many times for so long that the decision is now structural. It is built into the way they think. It is not a strategy, it is he paused, an orientation, direction they permanently face. The room was very still. And it spreads, Soren said. Yes. Because when you spend time near something that faces a direction, you start to feel the pull of that direction. Yes, she looked at the table, at her own hands. She had 40 years of decisions behind those hands, clean and cold and correct. She had built a career on the certainty that the math told you what to do and your job was to do it without flinching. What happens, she said slowly, if I revoke the order? Nothing dramatic, Riva said, not immediately. The occupation is still the occupation. The tribute system is still the tribute system. 134 garrison commanders go back to maintaining and pretend the last few days didn't happen. And long-term. Riva looked at her. Long-term, you're 47 years into an occupation of a species that has already changed 11% of the personnel you station near it without trying. You have two options. You can try to stop the contact, which means pulling all your people out of proximity to us and running the occupation entirely through remote administration, which will cut your efficiency by roughly 40% because we're the ones actually running the day-to-day logistics. Or you can accept that the contact continues and the percentage grows. Or I execute the order. Or that, Riva said. Flat even, not flinching from the word. But you've had the order for 4 days and you haven't executed it, so. The silence in the room was different. Now, show me the clause, Soren said. Vethsar pulled up the original submission documents on the room's display, the ones from year 1. Osa's careful bureaucratic language, the dense blocks of text that had been checked and signed by Calver lawyers who had checked nothing twice. The clause was on page 47. The submitted species retains the right to cultural expression as defined by its own internal tradition and is subject to productivity maintenance. Soren read it, then she scrolled down to the Calver lawyer's counter signature, which was dated year 1, day 6 of the occupation. She knew, Soren said, not a question. She knew, Vethsar said, she knew this would happen. She built the infrastructure for it, and she buried it In terms and conditions that my legal team signed without reading, yes. She died 25 years ago. Yes. Soren looked at the counter's signature. For a long time. She won the war before it started. We didn't know there was a war. She didn't think of it as a war, Riva said. I've read everything she left behind. All the notes, the private files, the things she didn't publish. She never used that word. She would have said she was just making sure we stayed ourselves. A pause. Why she thought that was enough. She thought if we could just stay ourselves for long enough in close enough contact with you, the rest would follow, the rest being. Soren said. You changing, Riva said simply. The same way everything changes when it spends enough time with us. The briefing lasted 11 hours. They ate in the room. Someone brought food at some point. Riva ate hers without looking at it, which was the kind of focused hunger that came from having a conversation. That felt like carrying a building with your hands. Vethsar talked for most of the 11 hours. He had 40 years of observations and a 700-page report and a secondary file and a painting wall, and he had been preparing for a conversation like this. Without knowing it, he talked about the music and the logistics system, the funeral in Eastern Europe, the soldiers who ate with local teams, the way the Sorrow Chorus's letter had traveled, the 17 failed translations, and the one note that had been crossed out. Soren listened. She was very good at listening. It was the skill that had gotten her to Preter voice level. Not the talking, not the deciding, but the listening that happened before both. The ability to stay in a room with difficult information and not flinch away from it into premature conclusions. At the end of the 11 hours, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I need to speak to High Command. I know, Vethsar said, I will revoke the order. I cannot promise what comes after the order being revoked. Neither can we, Riva said. Soren looked at her. The clause covers cultural expression. It does not cover the occupation framework, the tributes, the labor assignments. Not yet, Riva said. Soren almost smiled. Riva thought it was almost a smile. It was close enough. Not yet, Soren said. What came after was not clean. No one should say it was clean because it was not. It took 40 years. In those 40 years, there were Calver hardliners who called it capitulation, and there were human factions who called the negotiated restructuring a second surrender. And there were species across the Dominion who watched the whole thing with the careful, exhausted attention of beings who had been waiting for something like this for a long time and were not sure they trusted it yet. The Sorrow Chorus sent a transmission to Earth that arrived in the 32nd year of the restructuring negotiations. The transmission had no words. It was a frequency, 12 minds producing it together, a sound that human ears could not quite hear, but human chests could absolutely feel. It was the closest thing the Sorrow Chorus had to yes, the legal framework that changed everything turned out to be the clause, the specific bureaucratic, deliberately boring clause that Osei had buried in page 47 of the Year 1 submission documents. Her legal team, in the years after her death, had been quietly, carefully testing its applicability to other species under Dominion occupation. The cultural expression clause had been signed in the standard Tier 3 framework. It applied technically to every species under the frameworks Umbrella, 43 species filed for reclassification in the first decade. The Dominion's legal structure could not absorb 43 simultaneous reclassification requests. It was not built for that. It had never needed to be built for that. The process that followed the negotiations, the framework rewrites, the creation of new categories that the Dominion had no prior language for, took 2 generations. Ravakane spent 30 years of her life in those negotiations. She was the angriest person in every room she entered, and the rooms were full of angry people, and she was still the angriest. She was also consistently the one who found the exact words that could live in both rooms at once. The skill she had learned walking between her father's bitterness and her mother's pragmatism, the skill the occupation had built in her, whether she asked it to or not, she did not enjoy the work. Once she was very good at the work. When she retired, she was 78 years old, and she had spent 52 years doing that thing no one else wanted to do in the exact way it needed to be done. She went home to Lagos and she slept for 2 days, and then she called her mother's oldest friend and asked if he knew where any of Ada's old painting supplies were. He did not. She bought new ones. She was not a painter. She had never been a painter, but she had looked at the wall in Vesar's office enough times to know the rough shape of the thing. She made it badly and it looked like what it was, and she put it in the window where the light hit it in the morning. Vesar was assigned to the newly formed Galactic Reconciliation Commission, one of which had no precedent and no procedure manual, and a budget that most of high command considered embarrassingly small. He requested one allowance when he accepted the posting: permission to bring his paintings, all 91 of them. His request was approved. He set them up in his office at the commission, the same wall arrangement he had always used, the first one in the top left corner where the light hit it. First, he worked there for 15 years, long enough to see the framework that came out of the negotiations start to take shape, long enough to see 43 species begin the slow, tangled process of becoming something more than assets. He retired when he was old by any species standards, and he spent his last years in a house on his home world. He had brought the paintings with him, and he kept them on the wall. If people who came to see him sometimes asked about them, and he explained them in a way that took a long time because they were not a simple thing to explain. On the last painting, the 91st, Clear's Throat, which had arrived 2 years before he retired from the commission, Ada's granddaughter had written 3 words along the bottom in her own handwriting: "We're still here." He had read those words every morning. For years, he read them the last morning of his life, and he thought about a word in a human language that 17 translations had failed to capture, a word that he had spent 60 years carrying around like a stone in his pocket, feeling its edges, trying to understand its shape. He understood it. Now he had understood it for a while. He had, just like keeping it close. Sarish, the Osai Accords were signed 119 years after Amara Osai stood in front of a transmission console in Geneva and read the terms of humanity's submission in a voice that did not shake. The Accords were the founding document of the Galactic Commonwealth, not a perfect document, not a clean document, a document that had been argued over for 40 years by beings who did not fully trust each other and were doing it Anyway, which was the specific kind of document that lasted because it was built on something real. Ravakane's granddaughter represented humanity at the signing. She was 29 years old and she wore the same expression her grandmother had worn in the negotiations room, level-focused, with the door in her peripheral vision. She had her grandmother's gift for finding words that could live in two rooms at once. She also had in the inside pocket of her jacket a small piece of paper, a photograph printed on plain paper, the kind of printing that was technically low quality but preserved something about the original that high quality reproduction missed. The first painting, slightly crooked, orange and red and burning yellow. A bird that was barely recognizable as a bird made by a child with more feeling than skill. She kept it in her pocket for luck. She kept it in her pocket because her grandmother had told her to. She kept it in her pocket because some things needed to be carried. The signing was brief. The accords were long when it was done. The representative from the sorrel chorus, all 12 minds, he presented their full form for the first time at a public event in 40 years. Produced the frequency again, the one that human ears could not quite hear but human chests absolutely could. The hall was full of beings from 47 species. Every one of them felt it. In the preamble to the OSI Accords, printed before the legal text began, was a note. Not a legal clause, not a policy statement, a personal note found in Amara Osei's private files 30 years after her death, reprinted by her granddaughter because it was the only sentence that said the whole thing. Her granddaughter had been the one to suggest including it. The Kelver representative had read it and looked up and said yes in a way that closed the discussion. They thought submission was an ending. We knew it was an entrance. 847 species. The number in the original Dominion census taken 3,000 years before, when the Kelver first began building what they built. The Commonwealth census taken the year the accords were signed, listed 851 species. 4 new species had made contact in the preceding decade. All 4 of them, upon making contact with the Commonwealth, had specifically asked the same question in slightly different ways but with the same meaning. Are the humans real? We have heard about them. Are they really like that? The Commonwealth representatives from 7 different species, none of them human, had answered in 7 slightly different ways that all had the same meaning too. Yes, and you'll want to spend time with them. Don't fight it. Just let it happen. It won't hurt. Well, it will a little, but only in the way that things hurt when they are becoming larger. You'll understand. They always understood eventually. That was the thing about humanity that no model had ever predicted and no translation had ever captured and no commission report had ever fully contained in its conclusions. They were not the strongest species. They were not the fastest or the oldest or the most technologically advanced or the most strategically sophisticated. They were the most contagious, not with disease, not with ideas exactly, though ideas were part of it, with the specific, irrational, structurally embedded human habit of treating other beings like they were worth knowing, like they were interesting, like the time spent understanding them was not wasted time but the whole point. You spend enough time near that, it got into you, and once it was in you, you could not get it back out again. You found after a while that you did not want to. The galaxy changed, not overnight, not cleanly, not without cost, or argument, or 40 years of negotiations. In rooms full of people who did not fully trust each other. Slowly, the way all real things changed. From the inside out, in the dark, before anyone knew to look, a child walked into an administrator's building with a painting. The rest followed.